the session 3 of DRCN 2021. My name is Massimo Tornatore. I'm an associate professor here in Politecnico di Milano, and I welcome all of you to this interesting technical session. So the way we will proceed is the following one. I already promoted Ruja Zhou to being presenter, but Ruja, you will not take control of the presentation now. I'm going to share your video, the video that you have provided us. And after that, I will just give you the podium for answering the question. So in about 13 minutes from now. Regarding the other presenters, which I think are Nicola Di Cicco, Antonio Eira, and Goxel Simsek, I will promote them to speakers, to presenters, only when it will be their turn. Okay, so if there are no questions, without further delay, we can start with the first presentation, with the first talk. The first talk is titled Drama, Disaster Management Algorithm with Mitigation Awareness for Elastic Optical Networks by Ruja Zhou, Hiroshi Hasegawa, and Suresh Subramaniam.
Zhu from the George Washington University. Hello everyone, this is Ruja Zhu from the George Washington University. I'm going to present our paper, Drama, Disaster Management Algorithm with Mitigation Awareness for Elastic Optical Networks. I'm going to introduce our paper from 6 sections: motivations, novel designs, problem statement, disaster recovery algorithm, simulation result, conclusion, and future directions. So first of all, the disaster, so survivability is a crucial aspect for optical networks. A special case for survivability is the disaster management. So the conventional survivability techniques are typically designed for small-scale failure, such as single-node failure or single-link failure. However, in disasters such as earthquakes or hurricanes, they may cause large-scale damage to networks. For example, the hurricane, the earthquake, or a very large-scale power outage. And here is our first motivation of this work. So when we do the recovery, there is a competition caused by the recovered lattice. So suppose this is a network and this is the disaster zone. So when the disaster happens, the affected traffics are needed to be recovered with new spectrum resources. So right here is T3. T1 and T2, they are unrecoverable. For T3, we need to find another path for this traffic. So that is T3 prime. And suppose there's another traffic T4 right here, and then there is a competition. This competition is caused by the bottleneck problem due to disabled nodes and links. This is our first motivation. And our second motivation is services that are far away from the disaster should not be affected during the recovery process. For example, suppose there's a traffic sent from California to New York City, and there's a disaster in the middle of the US, and this traffic is affected. So, but however, it's normal that the users of the traffic, they do not want to be affected by this disaster, since both of them, they are far away from this disaster. So this is a requirement. This is a requirement of the of a traffic, and this is also a requirement of network users. So this is our second motivation. And based on these motivations, we made some new designs here. First of all, for the traffics inside the disaster zone, they are unrecoverable. We can do nothing toward them. And the second thing is we propose a new concept named mitigation zone, which is an area surrounding the disaster zone. So when the disaster happens in the real world, usually the government provides supply assistance to the disaster zone from the places close to the disaster. So inspired by this idea, we designed this mitigation zone to provide a better recovery. So the mitigation zone is established to help the recovery of the affected traffics. So mitigation zone can also be regarded as sort of assistance zone as well, right? So here's what we're doing in the mitigation zone. So suppose there are 3 traffics in the mitigation zone, T4, T5, and T6. And T4 is affected, so we need to we need to provide recovery to T4. And T5 and T6, even they are not affected, we do the rerouting and spectrum assignment as well. So that means we reorganize the spectrum resources inside the medication zone to provide a better recovery to all the traffics. And we think this is not enough. So we do one more step. We provide the degradation service. So suppose the mitigation factor is H, and then the traffic will be recovered at 1 minus H data rate. So if H equals to 0.2, the data rate before the disaster is 100 gigabits per second. Now we offer 80 gigabits per second. For the unaffected zone, suppose traffic T7 right here, that's quite similar with the case. The traffic sent from California to New York City. And we do the recovery with full data rate with no degradation. And T8 is the traffic outside the mitigation zone and not affected. We do not need to touch it at all, so we do not touch it. Right. And then here's the problem statement. So given a network, given a disaster, given a mitigation zone, and given a set of traffic, the objective is recover affected traffic, do the re-RSA to the traffic inside the mitigation zone, and then minimize the total penalty. So what is the penalty here? So before the penalty, please let me introduce the revenue. So in this work, the revenue of a traffic equals to the data rate of a traffic of a lab pass. As the penalty indicates the percentage of revenue loss when a lab pass service is degraded. And here is the penalty function. So suppose one lab pass required 8 slots, and now we provide only 6 slots. That means 2 slots degraded. And then the DF equals to 0.5, and the value of penalty function equals to 0.11, and then the actual value of penalty equals to the value of penalty function times the revenue. Then that is 44. So this particular penalty function is chosen so that the penalty is small for small degradation values and increase more quickly as the degradation increases. The penalty is 0 if the degradation, if there's no degradation, and the penalty equals to data rate if we totally drop this call. All right, and then we come to the JAMA algorithm, which is standard for disaster management algorithm with mitigation awareness. So we're doing 2 things right here: determines the order in which the traffic will be recovered, and also determines the degradation factor for each traffic and do the RSA. So for the order of recovery, all the requireable affected traffics and affected inside the mitigation zone are sorted in terms of revenue efficiency in non-increasing order. Revenue efficiency is defined as the revenue of the traffic divided by the minimum spectrum cost. The lab paths are considered for recovery in non-increasing order of RE because these lab paths that which have highest RE, the lab paths have the highest RE. That means they have the highest revenue per unit spectrum cost. So this is the reason why we sort them with RE. And here then we come to the recovery algorithm. So before we get started the sorting and do the recovery, we need to release spectrum of unrecoverable lab paths and lab paths that can be recovered by reassign. And then we sort all the traffics based on the revenue efficiency. And for the traffics outside the mitigation zone and affected, when we do the recovery, we use the short path first feed with no. These traffics are outside the mitigation zone. These traffics are from the users far away from the disaster. We don't have them affected. And then for the traffics inside the mitigation zone, what we're gonna do is to first determine the number of slots needed without service degradation for the highest level modulation on the shortest path of surviving network. So suppose this traffic requires 8 slots. So we have 9 candidate degradation options from 0 to 8. Then we calculate the potential penalty for each option. And the penalty function is the sum of current penalty and the future penalty. Finally, the candidate option with the lowest potential penalty is selected for this traffic. All right. Okay, so here's how we calculate the potential penalty. So for the current penalty, that is calculated based on the current degradation option. For the future penalty, we trying to evaluate the consequence of the current dequotation option assignment. So if we assign the traffic with this option, what is the consequence? And the future penalty is the sum of left pass future penalty. And the left pass future penalty is calculated based on the ADR and RDR right here. So the request data rate and available data rate. All right. So if the RDR is lower than ADR, that means the request data rate is lower than available data rate. That means we're pretty good when we calculate the basic penalty right here. And if ADR is lower than RDR, that means we're not good. We need to do some dequotation to make sure that RDR is not higher than ADR. And then we calculate the penalty for penalties for each waiting lap test, and sort them based on the penalty efficiency, which is defined as number of slots saved divided by the absolute value of penalty. And the P is initialized with 1 slot saved if this traffic is inside the mitigation zone, and P is initialized with all slots saved if it is outside the mitigation zone. All right, and here is what we're doing. So we keep doing the granular dequotation to the traffics on this pass until RDR becomes least than ADR. So suppose here is a network and there are 6 slots available right here. So we're calculating the option the option that 2 slots degraded for T0 for traffic 0, and we have 6 slots remaining here, but there are 3 traffics that are waiting to be assigned, and they require 9 slots. So we calculate the PE, the penalty efficiency, and do 1 slot grade for the traffic with high speed, that is T3, and then we update PE, and we found T2 has the highest penalty efficiency, and we keep doing this until the right here is RDR is 6 and the ADR is 6. Then we're good. We use this way to calculate the future penalty and select the appropriate dequotation factor for each traffic. And then after this, we come to the simulation settings. We test the drama algorithm in 2 networks and 3 disasters. And here is the traffic settings and how we determine the modulation format. And these are 2 baseline algorithms: no mitigation, that is affected traffics are recovered with random order and SPFF. And in no dequotation, we sort all the traffic in random order, but we do the reassignment. But there's no dequotation. All right, so here's the final result. It shows that the drama is much better than the baseline algorithm in terms of total penalty. And also here's the result of ADF. ADF is standard for average dequotation factor. Right, and also the result of COS 239 network is shown here. Right, and finally, we also take a look at the bandwidth blocking ratio right here, and we can see that the bandwidth blocking ratio of the drama is better than the baseline algorithm, and also like right here, the TU BBR is right here. It's traffic unaffected. TU is traffic unaffected. The BBR left paths that are the bandwidth blocking ratio left paths that are inside the mitigation zone but not directly affected by the disaster. So that is the cause. Not affected, but we touch it. We do the reassignment. The block ratio of these calls are very low as well. All right, so finally, the conclusion: the proposed algorithm is able to select an appropriate dequotation factor, and the proposed algorithm has a better performance in terms of total penalty and blocking ratio. In the future, what we're going to do is we're going to work on the IOP and break the spectrum continuity constraint with driver generator, and also push forward in the machine learning work. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ruja, for providing the talk. We have now 4 minutes that can be used for questions. Ruja, if you want, you can. I mean, if you'd like, you can turn on your video. And I'm trying to access the chat to see if there are questions. There are no questions at this point. Any question from the audience? Jacek?
Yes.
Please, go ahead. Go ahead.
Hi, Massimo. Welcome, everybody. So I have one quick question. Maybe I haven't noticed, I mean, assumptions behind the size of disaster zones. So my question is if the experiments were also made in relation to different areas of disasters, and how practical is it that every element inside the disaster zone is subject to a complete failure, such that, I mean, the service is non-restorable, yes? These are two questions I'd like to ask you.
Good afternoon to everyone.
Oh, okay. Thank you for the question. So in our work, we try 3 different cases. So the disaster happened at node 7, node 2, and node 6 in 2 different topologies. So we set these 2 disaster zones because we think that let's say for the NSF network, when the disaster happened at node 7, that is that represents the disaster happened at the middle of the network, and node 2 in NSF that is we want to show that what can happen if the disaster happened at sort of edge of the network, and we assume that all the links and all the nodes inside the disaster zone are disabled, so those traffics are not be able to be recovered.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Jacek.
Yeah, so I will now raise my hand. Yeah.
I think Guido has a question.
Yes, thank you. I think my question follows Jacek's question before. I didn't catch how do you define the mitigation zone? So because, okay, you talk about this algorithm that takes into account this mitigation zone, but is it pre-planned or do you set it up after the disaster? If you give more insights about that.
All right, thank you for the question. So for the mitigation zone, we just simply set it to sort of given range. So as we can see from the results, so what we plan to show is that given a larger mitigation zone, that means we are given a higher flexibility to do the reorganize to the spectrum. So when the size of mitigation zone is very large, we can see that the total penalty is getting lower. So this is what we plan to show. So suppose there's a case that let's say full mitigation case. So entire network outside the disaster zone are mitigation case, is the mitigation zone. So that is the best case because we can feel free to rerouting and spectrum assignments, re-RSA to all the traffic. So that is the best case actually.
Okay.
Right. So that is so larger mitigation zone means higher flexibility to rearrange all the things there.
Okay. So thank you. I catch.
Thank you, Guido. Thank you, Ruja, for your answers. I see that there are other questions, but in the interest of time, I would move on to the next talk. I would encourage everybody to leave questions in the chat, and the author, the presenter, is free to give an answer via chat to the questions. Okay, so now we can move to the next speaker. Next speaker is Nicola Di Cicco. Hi, Nicola. I think you're already been promoted to speaker. I will start as in the previous case. I will share your video, and then we will add some 4 or 5 minutes for questions. Okay.
I'm Nicola Di Cicco, and today I will present our work titled Scalable Multi-Objective Optimization of Reliable Latency-Constrained Optical Transport Networks. The reference scenario for our study is the CRAN network model. In the C-RAN, the baseband functions, the BBUs, are decoupled from the remote radio units, the RRUs. RRUs communicate with BBUs via high-capacity front-haul links, and BBU functions related to different RRUs can be virtualized and hosted in the same node, which is called BBU Hotel. In the URLLC service class, optimal BBU placement needs to address both reliability and latency. In particular, reliability is addressed via proper redundancy of the BBU functions and latency via delay constraints for each served RRU. In literature, ILP models have been developed. However, they tend to suffer from scalability issues as the number of nodes in the transport network increases. Therefore, our aim is to investigate algorithmic approaches for tackling the scalability issue. In the aggregate approach developed in a previous work, a hierarchy of importance was assumed among the objectives. Because of that, objectives can be ordered according to their importance and optimized sequentially. Therefore, we propose an algorithm based on lexicographic optimization. From the computational results, this approach is able to return the optimal solution for the most relevant objectives in network with several tens of nodes. And for the largest network with 100 nodes, this approach is able to find much better quality solutions than the aggregate approach. For our problem statement, as we said before, a node enabled to perform BBU functions is called BBU Hotel. The distance among nodes is measured in the number of hops, and the access to BBU functions is called port. Our sharing policy is that the backup ports only can be shared among RRUs that do not share the same primary BBU hotel. The resulting problem is multi-objective, where the three following objectives have to be minimized. First, the total number of active BBU hotels. Second, the total number of hops needed to connect BBU hotels and RRUs. And third, the total number of backup ports. Since in previous literature, and according to the considered application, there is a hierarchy among objectives, the problem is divided in three optimization steps. The lexicographic ordering is implemented by using the solutions computed at the higher priority steps to constrain the lower priority steps. In this way, the lower priority steps cannot worsen the solutions achieved in the higher priority steps. Therefore, overall optimization consists in three subproblems to be solved in order, each with NP-hard complexity. It is important to note that a different priority order would produce solutions of scarce practical relevance, where most, if not all, BBU hotels would be active. The table on the left shows the notation that it is used for the model formulation, and on the right we see the formulation for the first step, which is the minimization of the number of active BBU hotels. Constraints 2 and 3 impose that each RRU has a primary and backup BBU hotel assigned. Constraints 4 impose that primary and backup BBU hotels for each RRU are not the same. Constraints 5 impose that the distance between a RRU and its BBU hotels does not exceed the maximum. This maximum distance constraint can be formulated like that because due to constraint 4 and the fact that variables are binary, the term within the parentheses is at most equal to 1. Finally, constraint 6 impose that the number of wavelengths in each front-haul links does not exceed the maximum. For step 2, that is the minimization of the number of hops, we have the same constraints as the step before, plus an additional constraint. Constraint 11, as we hinted before, imposes that the first objective with higher priority is not worsened in the solution of the second step. The third and final step is the minimization of the number of backup ports. We have all the constraints of the previous step plus some additional ones. Constraints 13 and 14 count the number of backup ports according to the sharing policy mentioned before. Constraints 15 impose that the objective of step 2 is not worsened in the same fashion of constraint 11, and constraint 16 sets a lower bound on the optimal solution value for this step. For the numerical results, regular lattice networks of increasing number of nodes have been considered, as you can see from the figure, with 10 RRUs per node and a maximum of 80 wavelengths per link. The table on the left shows some numerical results achieved on these benchmark instances, and the results for the aggregate multi-objective approach were derived based on the work cited below. In this work, the objective function was computed as a weighted sum of the three objectives, and therefore, in order to compare fairly the two approaches, an equivalent gap for the lexicographic approach has been computed, according to the formula illustrated here in the bottom right. In the table, we read the approach that has been used, the number of nodes in the network, and the maximum number of hops. Then there is the solution, the number of active VBU hotels, the number of hops, the number of backup ports, and the gap associated to the computed solution. In general, we can say that the lexicographic approach presents very small gap in all instances, but the largest one. And for that instance, that is 100 nodes and maximum hops equal to 6, the produced solution of the lexicographic is of much higher quality with respect to the aggregate, with 8 active BBU hotels versus 18. In only one instance, the aggregate produces a better solution than the lexicographic, with a marginal improvement in the third step, which is, however, the lesser priority one. For execution was set to 1 hour with 200 seconds for steps 1 and 2 and 3200 seconds for step 3. Tests for 4000 seconds of time limit were also performed, showing no notable improvements with respect to the previous results. On the left, we see the plots of the execution times of the aggregate and of the first two steps of the lexicographic approach. In particular, we can observe that the lexicographic approach, for all instances but the largest, is able to guarantee optimality of the first two steps. The aggregate reaches the timeout in all but 2 instances and produces solutions with larger gaps than the lexicographic as the instance size increases. For the only instance in which the first step of the lexicographic approach reaches the timeout, the aggregate approach produces a much worse quality solution with more than double the gap. From the plots, one can see that by increasing the maximum number of hops, we allow for more centralization. We have less active BBU hotels at the price of having a larger number of wavelengths in the front haul links. Even though the maximum number of hops was increased up to 6, we can see that the average number of hops per RRU does not exceed 3 for our reference networks. This shows that the minimization of the total number of hops is not jeopardized, even though it has lesser priority than the minimization of the number of active nodes. In the figures on the left are shown the number of hops and ports distinguished between primary and backup for the 64 nodes network. One can observe that in some instances the number of primary hops is greater than the number of backup hops and vice versa. This is because in our lexicographic ordering, primary and backup hops are given the same priority. For what concerns the ports, it has been said that primary ports cannot be shared, and therefore their number is fixed to the total number of RRUs. Backup ports can be shared and therefore optimized, even though they have the lowest priority. Being the least priority objective, in fact, fluctuations can be expected in the optimal solution value. Some additional results were obtained on the 49 and 64 nodes networks, in which 10 random links have been removed, as you can see from the figure. This was done in order to verify that the performance evaluations made before are maintained in a similarly connected but less regular network. From the table on the left, one can observe that the lexicographic algorithm performs better than the aggregate in a similar fashion, if not better, with respect to the results presented before. To conclude, an algorithm based on lexicographic optimization able to tackle the scalability issue for optimal BBU placement has been shown. The algorithm can scale much better with respect to an aggregate multi-objective approach, and it can guarantee optimality of the most relevant objectives for networks of several tens of nodes. Regarding future work, the main bottleneck for the lexicographic algorithm is the third step, which is port optimization. Being the least priority objective, one can envisage heuristic algorithms in order to compute efficiently good solutions. We have some results based on simple heuristics, such as fixing some variables, and they are close, and in some cases even better, than the results provided by the solver, but all in few seconds of computational time. Finally, the model can be extended in order to take into account dynamic traffic, and therefore migration of the virtual BBU functions among BBU hotels. In this way, the provided solution would quickly adapt to the traffic scenario, minimizing the number of migration needed to satisfy the dynamic traffic requests. That is all for my side, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Nicola. You can turn on your video or your mic, and if you want, you can also share the slides to facilitate the question time. Any question? Let me see in the chat. Maybe we have something already. No, it's from the previous. So any question? I think Omran has a question. Please. Oh, we cannot hear you.
Yes, now I guess now you should hear me.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Prof. And thank you, Nicola, for the very clear presentation. I had several questions, but then while you go with your slides, the number of questions decreased, I have to say. I still have one, and it's related to the time limit you set. It's just more of a curiosity. I would just, I think slide 8.
Okay.
Yes, this one. So you see the time limit was set to 1 hour, but then I see that you considered a shorter time limit for steps 1 and 2, which are of high priority, but then a much longer one. So I assume you did some analysis.
Yes, we have seen that the first 2 steps were let's say easier to solve, and therefore they take less time. And the main result here is that the first 2 steps here are solved very fast, and therefore since they are the most important, one can arbitrarily interrupt the algorithm at every time during the 3rd step and get a solution with the first 2 steps that are confirmed to be optimal. And this is the way we did this. This is why we did this this subdivision of the overall 1 hour of 200 seconds, 200 seconds, and 3,200 seconds.
But then in the case of 100, so in the case of 100 nodes, I see you said that you reach the timeout. So when you say reach the timeout, you reach the timeout of 200 seconds dedicated for. Okay. Why didn't you think of? I mean, since you are allowing 3,600 seconds, why didn't you think of allowing in specific conditions or specific network scenarios more time for step 1 and step 2?
We performed such test for the 100 nodes networks, and we verified that even given 1 hour, it would not converge to optimum. So we preferred to remain in stricter time limits with respect to the quality of the solutions that was produced. Because here it is not shown, but if you see the log of the solver within the 1 hour of node optimization, the solver does not find better solution, but it tries to improve only the lower bound. So it is reasonable to let's say make a conjecture that the solution that we find is actually the optimal one, but we cannot prove it, and therefore we have a gap.
Okay, thank you so much, Nicola. Very clear.
Thank you too.
Prof, you are on mute. Yeah.
Sorry. Any other question from the audience? We have another 1 or 2 minutes to be used. If not, I would ask a quick question. So you selected...
There is a question on the chat.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Nicola. So the question is, I'm reading for everybody. Directly minimizing the number of hops may not minimize the distance between the nodes. Is it right?
The distance between nodes, let's say, is fixed by the topology. And what we are trying to minimize is that if we centralize BBU functions in one node, we want those BBU functions to be close in the terms of the maximum number of hops we allow to the RRUs that they manage. But the distance is a matter of the topology. We used the number of hops as the metric, but one can use whatever he likes.
Yeah, I guess when you say, I don't want to read the mind of the person asking the question, but I think depending on the routing, you might have different distances, right? Even though the topology is fixed.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, so if you minimize the number of hops, indeed, you're not directly minimizing the distance, but I think you have a constraint on the distance, right?
Yes, the distance is constrained to be, it is written here, is constrained to be less than a maximum, which is defined by the application requirement. In this sense, we ensure that the assignment we do with the BBU hotels respects those this constraint.
Okay, so we have, well, no, it's already time for the next speaker. So thank you very much, Nicola, for the very clear presentation.
Thank you.
Question time. Next speaker is Antonio Eira. Hi, Antonio. Are you there? Can you?
Hi, Massimo. Yeah.
Okay, great. So I see that the microphone is working. As usual, I'll start sharing the video and then we'll start with the question time.
I'll be presenting this paper. So I'll do a brief motivation to the coherent interfaces, the survivability in next-generation networks. Then we'll go into the network scenario and the survivability methods we considered, a bit about the planning model, and then some results and discussion. So the optical transport market is always looking to minimize the cost per bit, and this is usually achieved by maximizing optical interface capacity, which is why coherent detection has been gaining so much traction across more and more segments, going into the metro and into some access-facing applications. Now, this happens for multiple reasons. One is that traffic in metro is growing beyond what direct detect can usually offer. And also because the ICPs have significantly altered traffic patterns. So data center interconnect basically brought very specific requirements with it, pushed by these ICPs. So mostly related to very footprint and power consumption optimized chassis being required in these networks. So this gave a big push for pluggable coherent interfaces. As an example, the 400G ZR standard, so the kind of the initial one, came as a way to support short reach point-to-point DCI links, and this expanded into agreements that now look to broaden the scope of pluggable coherence, such as OpenZR Plus and OpenROADM. So basically, the market is evolving towards these two flavors of optical interfaces. So on one hand, the pluggable coherent with very strong focus on small form factors and limited power consumption, and this is done typically by limiting the capabilities of the DSP itself. And also to some extent the electronics and the symbol rate that they can provide. On the other hand, we have what we're calling IHN coherent, which is basically the standalone transponders where system vendors give it all they got. So they use state-of-the-art DSP, the electronics enabled to go up to 100 gigabaud per carrier. And this kind of gives you the optimal reach and capacity trade-off, because you can always use, the very best performing for transmission mode for any light path requirement. So the technology choice of which to go for in the extremes of the application range, it's pretty clear. So if you have something that requires a lot of reach and or a lot of capacity, such as subsea, ultra long haul, then you most likely will have to go with high-end coherent. If you're going for not so constrained scenarios, probably pluggable coherent can give you a lower cost offset from the start. Now, it's in between that really the discussion is brewing in the market today, because standards such as OpenZR Plus, they're targeting increasingly ambitious market segments. So going into mesh ROADM networks in the metro core, even some almost long haul deployments. And when we look at this, so the typical techno-economic analysis for this is usually looking at what are the requirements of my light paths, what's the fiber plant, what are the requirements in terms of optical performance, and from there you can sort of derive which would be the lowest cost. What we're looking at here in this paper is something that is usually kind of brushed aside, which is what is the impact when we consider survivability on the optical layer? How does it shift the traditional techno-economic analysis? Now, the reason why optical survivability can shift these boundaries significantly is, so the trade-off between high-end coherent and pluggable coherent essentially amounts to checking the interface count savings I'm going to get with these higher performing transponders versus the extra cost of the transponders versus their pluggable counterparts. Now, when I consider something like optical protection, so for instance, layer 0 line side protection, what I find is that I no longer am constrained by the performance of my working path. I am now constrained by the performance of the cycle, so both the working and the backup paths, which means that I either have to lower the rate I'm using for my working path to be compatible with also the backup, which is typically much longer, or I have to deploy additional regenerators on the backup path. So obviously this will shift, the optical requirements for a given network scenario, whether or not I need to use optical protection. Beyond that, we can even use something like shared restoration. So in shared restoration, in case I'm, deploying additional backup regenerators, some of them may actually be shared between multiple working demands, which can lower the amount of interfaces I actually need to deploy. So this, as you see, is a very specific and intricate scenario where we need to consider both the technology options, coupled with both the protection options that we are considering for a specific scenario, and see how the techno-economics of the issue basically shift when we consider these different planning options. So in terms of the optical interfaces that we used, so for OpenZR Plus, we considered the formats, the transmission modes that are foreseen in the standard itself between 100 and 400G, the required OSNR also given in the standard. For high-end coherent, so we're taking data from Infinera and also from other suppliers, and we're assuming it's a sort of baseline approach where we go from 300 to 800 gigabit per second per carrier. We can play with the symbol rate, play with the modulation format, including using probabilistic shaping. And that basically gives us any arbitrary combination of rate and width for a channel, which is here, discrete, turned into a discrete set of transmission modes that are, most suitable for most applications, but where we have significantly more format granularity than in OpenZR Plus. So in terms of the line system and the performance model, so we are looking into ROADM networks with route and select express architectures and CD-AD drop layers. For the performance model, nothing special. So we calculate the residual margin for each channel. For the nonlinear impairments, we are using the Gaussian noise model. So the survivability methods, we look into 3 different methods where we need to provide when we need to provide resiliency, it's against single link failures. So we either have an unprotected scenario, so just a working channel. We have 1+1 line side protection, where we split the signal to different head drop ports and we replicate in the working and the backup path. And we have shared restoration, where the ROADM is doing the switching between the working and backup path, and which means that I can actually, for working demands that don't share any links, I can share both the spectrum and backup regenerators in the backup. So the design framework uses an ILP model that minimizes the optical interface count, so both the transponders and the regenerators. And the model is fed basically with candidate cycles between each demand's node pair. The way this is done is basically computing the shortest paths for each node pair, from there deriving the shortest cycles. And then for the shortest cycles, we further subdivide them into all the options for backup regenerator placement. So because we need all the placement options for backup regenerators to do the sharing in case of shared restoration. In the end, we post-process, so we actually do spectrum assignment and fix any potential spectrum continuity issues with added regenerators. So the topologies we consider were the Spanish backbone network and the Italian backbone network for, let's say, European-sized country networks, and also a US continental topology, so the coronet topology. The client traffic uses 100 and 400 gigabit per second clients, so equally split between them. For the traffic spatial distributions, so for SPN and IBN, we used publicly available sets. You can check the paper for them. For coronet, we assume that the traffic is concentrated in 10% of the node pairs, and the results are average over 10 independent runs of the model. So in terms of the results, what we see is that for SPN and IBN, so the smaller networks, the transponder counts for high and coherent, they change very little when we go from unprotected to protected and also to restoration. So there's a very small gap. And this is because of the format granularity, which allows the model to choose, basically the most efficient transparent format for each light path. So if we need to support also the backup, it means we're not necessarily going to need more transponders. We can just, for instance, increase the baud rate of the channel itself and use a bit more of spectrum. For OpenZR+, this does not hold. So for OpenZR+, if I go from unprotected to protected, the larger the network, the larger the additional interfaces I need to deploy. So as a heads up, in the SPN, we go from 42% savings with unprotected to 46% with protected. In IBN, we already go from 28 to 39% savings, so which is quite significant. When we apply shared restoration, what it does is it lowers the amount of backup regenerators that we need. So since IN Coherent didn't deploy that many regenerators to begin with, it doesn't really benefit from shared restoration as much as OZR+, which can save about 2/3 of the backup regenerators due to optimized sharing. So there it claws back some of this gap that we saw with protection. Now, when we go to the larger topology, coronet, here the interface savings, so they are maximals because this is really the larger network. So we have 41% savings with unprotected, 50% with protection, and then we claw back some with restoration again for OpenZR+, and we get 46% savings. Now, when we correlate these results with the spectrum occupation, we see that for SPN and IBN, the savings in interface count, they actually are accompanied by savings in spectrum as well. So we are saving on interfaces as well as spectrum. For coronet, we see that we are actually using a bit more of spectrum with IN Coherent for protected scenarios than with OpenZR+. And the reason is the way we maximize the interface count here is by massively shifting towards very high baud rate interfaces. So the share of interfaces here using over 90 gigabaud channels is very large, which makes the spectrum consumption also a bit larger in this case. So in conclusion, we saw that we have an increase in adoption for coherent interfaces, and we have this split between IN coherent and pluggable coherent options, and the best option is typically set by the characteristics of the light paths I have to serve. So optical survivability can shift this boundary significantly. And so what we saw with our planning model is that high-end coherent, we can support protection and restoration with between 38 to 50% fewer interfaces than OpenZR+, thanks to the format granularity of high-end coherent. With shared restoration, we kind of claw back a bit of this gap, thanks to sharing the regenerators that we need to use more with OpenZR+. So with the smaller networks, we also see that the high-end coherent interface savings, they come also with savings in used spectrum. In the continental network scenario, so really the larger topology, we see that these savings are actually achieved mostly by turning up the symbol rate, which means that the relative spectrum consumption will increase a bit. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, again, thank you, Antonio, for registering a very clear talk, very interesting. I open the floor to question, and I ask Antonio to go on mute and possibly also to share slides, if possible. Any question? If there are no questions, I can start with the question. Antonio, are you there? Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I was wondering, let me see, what time is it? We have 5 minutes for questions. I can take the entire 5 minutes if nobody intervenes. So is it possible to have a regenerator in which you enter HEC and you exit ZR plus? So a sort of hybrid regenerator? And would it make sense?
It depends. So you can certainly enable it if your DSP would be compatible with both, which is an option. It's not an option that, let's say, all vendors are going for, also because you need to do some adaptation. It also depends on the type of OpenZR Plus you are considering and where you are deploying it. So here, I didn't clarify because for the paper maybe not so interesting, but we are assuming these are OpenZR Plus CFP2 interfaces. So they would be really, let's say, transponder boxes and not QSFP-DD in routers. So I would say if you want to regenerate on standalone transponder boxes like we have here, and you have compatible DSP modes, you could do both. That is an option. Although not possibly every vendor would be supporting that. If you are doing it on the router, then no, because then you cannot have the high-end coherent coming out of the router on the QSFP-DD. That needs to be on a CFP2. Okay, thank you. Very quick thing. I see at a certain point there was a ROSNR. Was it? So what is ROSNR? It's the required OSNR, so okay, it's the... No, I thought there was, since now there's GSNR and so on, I thought it was another... Yeah, we calculate the GOSNR, but the ROSNR, so it's what we have to, it's the benchmark. So it's basically what is announced, let's say, in the standard for the OZR Plus cases. Doesn't mean that it can't, you can't do better than that. But, for the purposes of the paper, we have to assume something. So we took the advertised value, let's say. But you could possibly go a few tenths of a dB better than that, probably. Any other questions from the audience? I don't want to take the entire time. I don't see other questions, so I'm going with another one. I was a bit surprised and I got a bit lost when you explained the reason why in some scenarios you do not really need much additional transponders for protection. Okay. I was expecting all the cases doubling in the number of interfaces, right?
working and backup, but
No, so this is line side protection, right? So let's
okay.
say it's if every path was the same working and backup, you would not need any additional transponder. So it would be zero, really. The issue is typically it depends on the network a bit. But for instance, for that coronet, you have a lot of node pairs where you have a one link working path, and the backup path goes around I don't know, 15, 16 hops. So you could potentially do 800G on the working, but your backup is actually going to be really, really constrained, and this is where this kicks in. Now, what happens there and where IAND coherent helps, let's say, is that you can grow on spectrum. So you can say, okay, I can't do, let's say, use a very aggressive modulation, but I can increase the baud rate from 30 gigabaud to 90 gigabaud, and the performance will be the same, basically.
Efficient tester.
Yeah, sorry, the next thing started since it's 16:56. Sorry,
Okay.
about that.
Sure, no problem.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer, Antonio, and for the presentation. I asked questions, so at the end I didn't introduce the next speaker. Sorry, so give me just a second to introduce the next speaker. I think he's Goxel Simsek. Just let me find it.
Yeah, I can raise my hand. You can hear me, by the way?
Yeah, thank you. If you can raise your hand, that would be easier. Thank you very much. Okay. I already did audio check. I see you can hear properly. The title of the talk, since I haven't given the title for the previous paper, is Efficient Network Monitoring via In-Band Telemetry by Goxel Simsek, Doganalp Ergenk, and Ertan Onur. I'm sure my pronunciation was very imperfect, but I did my best. So we can start with the video.
Hello, my name is Göksel, and I will present our paper, Efficient Network Monitoring via In-Band Telemetry. I will start with a brief introduction and cover what in-band network telemetry is and how it is deployed in the network. Then, I will describe 3 requirements that need to be satisfied to achieve efficient network monitoring using in-band network telemetry. Afterward, I will explain our heuristic approach, graph partitioned int, to satisfy these requirements. I will discuss our results and finish the presentation with the conclusion. I would like to mention the P4 language very briefly. In a nutshell, it provides the extended control over packet processing and forwarding pipelines to the maintainer. This flexibility allows customization or implementation of any protocol or measurements on demand. One of the applications proposed by the P4 consortium is the in-band network telemetry framework. In essence, this framework utilizes special packets to query switch information and store accumulated data on a single packet. In this work, we artificially generate these special packets and form int paths. In the figure, we show an example deployment of int paths. There are 2 different row packets guided by source routing headers, including the next forwarding port number for every switch. Upon the arrival of a probe packet, switches insert their telemetry headers to these packets. As one can notice, these probe paths have different lengths, SR1 being the smaller one. Consequently, SR1 is likely to arrive at the controller way earlier and will wait for SR2. Hence, the information SR1 may refer to an older state once SR2 arrives. This difference can hinder the controller from obtaining accurate results. Accordingly, we define several requirements to achieve efficient and effective monitoring using in-band network telemetry. Our first requirement is to cover every switch in the network to obtain a holistic view while minimizing the overhead of the controller. To achieve this overhead, the controller needs to send and parse few int packets. However, generating few int packets indicates that those paths are long and will spend more time in the network, exposing them to potential failures. On the other hand, if we generate too many, we will collect results faster but increase the load. Therefore, an efficient monitoring system should find a balance under various conditions. Our second requirement is delivering measurements concurrently so that the controller can always have access to the most accurate measurements of any given state. The path lengths should not vary too much to achieve concurrent delivery, since they correlate directly to the time spent in the network. Hence, the solutions should minimize the deviation of path lengths for concurrent reports. Finally, our last requirement is minimizing redundant information so that the available measurement pool can be maximized. To do so, the generated paths should be as disjoint as possible. In order to satisfy requirements, we propose a heuristic approach based on Kernighan-Linn's graph partitioning algorithm. Let me briefly explain the general layout of Kernighan-Linn's algorithm. Given the number of partitions to be desired, Kernighan-Linn's goal is to generate them based on certain objective functions to minimize or maximize. Accordingly, a typical Kernighan-Linn-based approach contains three main stages. The first stage is called initial partitioning phase, in which one generates partitions without considering objective functions primarily. So the goal is to generate baseline partitions to build improvements on. In the second stage, the goal is to improve the collector of given partitions based on defined objective functions. In this phase, one generally iterates over partitions and exchange nodes between others under certain rules. These rules may indicate which nodes are valid to be an exchange point. At the last stage, an algorithm runs the second phase until no positive improvements can be found. Let me continue with our implementation and modification of Kernighan-Linn's algorithm. We consider simple paths as partitions and enforce a rule that a path can only grow from its endpoints. Otherwise, a path would include a circle and increase redundant information. Furthermore, we require that every node should belong to at least one path. Our algorithm accepts k, the suggested maximum number of paths or partitions to be generated. Based on this value, we set a limit to the maximum length of a path to approximately generate balanced partitions. So at the start of this phase, we sort the nodes based on their degrees. Then, we start from the lowest degree node and form a new path. The grouping of a path is similar to performing a mix of depth first and breadth first traversal. We continue doing so until either we reach the length limit or we can no longer find suitable nodes. Suppose our path only contains a single node and cannot grow it any longer. In this case, we have two options. First, we check if we have a neighbor that is an endpoint of any path. If there is, then it would mean those paths halted growing due to the length limit. We relax this limitation in such cases to avoid generating a path with a length of 1. If there are no such neighbors, we then sort them based on the number of unvisited neighbors they have and select the one with the most. At the end of this stage, we return generated simple paths. We need to define objective values for the exchange phase, which are our requirements: the number of generated paths, length deviation, and the number of shared or overused switches. Then our objective function becomes the minimization of the summation of these requirements. So in the exchange phase, we accept P, current partitions, and G, the graph itself. The first thing we perform is calculating the local objective and generate an empty rule set L, which we save improvements. Then we iterate over paths until we process all of them. In each iteration, we generate an empty rule set R, which we will fill with potential improvements. Then, for every path, we check if they have unvisited endpoints. If we can find one, we check certain options to improve the current objective value. The first option is to check its neighbors to see if any of them are endpoints. If so, we can try capturing, which is removing a node from a path and appending it to the current one. If, for example, the target path contains only 2 nodes, we can also consider capturing both of them at the same time. Our second option is to overlap with another path. We consider overlapping on only longer ones because otherwise the objective value is likely to increase. All of these options return a set of node pairs which we calculate achieved gains using them. Afterward, we generate rules which include the achieved gain, nodes, and the paths involved. Those generated rules in R. After traversing all of the paths, we fetch the best rule that improves the objective value the most. If there are not any, we finish the exchange phase. Otherwise, we apply the best rule, update the rule set, objective value, and mark nodes involved as visited. In the end, we return the best rule obtained. In the last phase, we calculate the peak point of cumulative gain that can be achieved using the exchange phase rules and apply it to the actual partitions. Afterward, we feed the updated partitions to the exchange phase iteratively until we can no longer find improvements to the objective function. We divide our results into two categories. First, we perform analysis on Watt-Strogatz graphs. Then we measure the performance of the path generators on data center topologies. Our performance metrics are the requirements that we have defined in this work. Those are the number of generated paths correspond to the load of the controller, the length deviation indicating obtaining concurrent and accurate results, the number of shared switches indicating the amount of redundant information being collected. Lastly, we have the required time to generate solutions. This measurement shows the adaptability of solvers to topology changes. The quicker they are, the faster the controller can react. We compare our proposed GPINT with SNMP and earlier method which was published recently. Please note that the earlier method's goal is to cover every edge in the network. Also, the earlier method is reported to be dependent on the number of odd-degree vertices. In this work, we do not control such vertices, and our results may differ from the original work. We feed different k values to GPINT, and it affects the number of generated paths as k times number of vertices over 10. In this set of figures, we fix the number of edges each node has to 6 and increase the number of nodes. In figure A, we compare the number of generated paths. Since the SNMP probes every single node, it generates the maximum number of paths. Among GPINT, with different k values, the GPINT2 generates the least number of paths, followed by 3 and 5. On the other hand, the earlier method generates the least paths, indicating that it covers every edge with the considerably few paths. We see how this affects other objectives in figure B and C. In figure B, we have the deviation of the path lengths. We see that the earlier method fails to generate balanced paths. And we examine how GPINT performs, we see that it almost generates perfectly balanced paths with a maximum deviation of 0.5 with all k values. In figure C, we compare the number of shared switches. If the earlier method covers edges, they cannot avoid traversing a single node multiple times. Hence, they carry redundant information. On the other hand, GPINT generates disjoint paths almost every time. Therefore, we minimize the redundant information, which maximizes the available information pool. Here, we have the results of increasing the number of edges in the topology, while we fix the number of vertices to 100. In figure A, we compare the number of generated paths. For GPINT, the number of generated paths depends on the number of nodes, not the edges. Hence, we generate a constant number of paths. Interestingly, the edge seems to be not affected by the connectivity either, despite covering every edge. However, in figure B, we see that the edge fails to generate balanced paths as the number of edges increase in the network. So for GPINT, we can find a better balance in path lengths for all k values with increased connectivity. In figure C, we compare our last objective to the number of shared switches. As I mentioned earlier traverses a node multiple times to cover every edge. Consequently, when there are many edges, the earlier generates too much redundant information, making it undeployable in a real-life scenario to carry a large pool of information. GPINT minimizes redundancy, which increases the available measurement pool automatically. Hence, GPINT is perfectly suitable to deploy to carry any set of information that can be obtained from the switches. Our last measurement for path graphs is the elapsed time to generate solution. In figure A, we have results of the increasing number of vertices. We observe that threaded can take up to 14 seconds, while the GPINT can generate solutions under 2 seconds. In figure B, we have the results for increasing the number of edges. We see that threaded can take up to 4.5 seconds, while the GPINT can generate under 0.6 seconds. Finally, in our last comparison, we have two different data center topologies, FAT3 and leaf-spine. We highlight best results with bold text. For FAT3, we see that the earlier method generates either one path or equal number of paths to the GPINT. Similarly, in the case of the leaf-spine, the earlier method generates either one or more paths than the GPINT. However, whenever they do not generate one path, earlier fails to deliver balanced paths. Like our previous analysis, the earlier overuses nodes and cover every edge, which increases the redundancy. On the other hand, GPINT achieves minimization of both net deviation and the redundant information data center topologies as well. In conclusion, we have outlined 3 different requirements for in-band network telemetry-based path generators to achieve efficient network monitoring. These requirements were minimize control overhead, concurrent report delivery, and minimize redundant information. By addressing these requirements, we propose GPINT, which is an extension of the kernel net graph partitioning algorithm. Our results show that GPINT can maximize concurrent report delivery and minimize redundancy. Consequently, we state that the GPUs can adapt in-network conditions with different K values and carry a vast pool of information. And this concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Goxel. You can now turn your mic on, and if you want also your video, and share if you can also your slides, and we can open the question time on this presentation.
Okay.
Any question from the audience? Okay, if we don't have question, I would ask Sam. So when you introduce the problem, you talk about concurrently releasing information. I think it's slide 5 or 6. I think 5. Yeah, can you elaborate what it means exactly to generate a set of paths that delivers the packets concurrently?
Yeah, sure. So like in this figure, we have 2 different paths, right? So in this example, we release SR1 and SR2 at the same time. And since SR2 is kind of a longer path, it will take more time to get delivered to the controller due to one, propagation delay, and the processing delay occurs in the switches. And if you also consider like background traffic occurring in network, those processing delays will amount to immensely, right? So in that case, we need to balance the length so that at least we can somehow try to deliver the packets concurrently at the controller so that they can represent the same state of the network.
So it's sort of differential delay. Is you want the paths to be more or less of the same length?
Yeah, that's correct.
And it's all propagation. It's all related to the length of the links and the number of hops crossed. There's no relation with the congestion of the nodes in this process.
But actually, we don't consider the congestion while generating the paths, but in the simulations that we couldn't make out for this paper, but after we had 4 months to work on this work as well. So in simulations, actually, they get affected by the congestion levels as well. And another reason why generated balanced paths is great is because when a path loss occurs, like if we lose the prop packet for some arbitrary reason due to congestion or link failure, you won't lose too much information. So you can actually pinpoint the exact reason or exact whereabouts of where the packet get lost. So it also has that kind of a side effect that I kind of forget to mention during my presentation.
Very interesting. And regarding you commented on this like baseline algorithm which you have built on your solution, which was called Kernighan-Lin, if I'm...
Yeah, that's correct.
So can probably is in the previous slide, but is an algorithm for what exactly? The Kernighan algorithm?
Yeah, sure. Like it is an algorithm to generate partitions based on the K value. So you are trying to partition a graph based on your objective value. And in the original paper, it is the weight of the links between each partition. So yeah, you are trying to partition the graph such that your defined objective values are somehow minimized or maximized.
So is it the same problem that you're solving, or is it different?
No, it is a different one. So
because you're just partitioning, while in your case you do a covering with paths.
Yeah, that's true. And also we consider the partitions to be exactly simple paths so that they cannot contain any loops. For instance, if you can arbitrarily exchange nodes between partitions, you may create loops. And creating loops actually bad because you are first inducing extra latency because you are traversing the same device or multiple times. And Yeah.
Okay. Anybody from the audience wants to add anything? If not, I think we are in perfect timing for the coffee break. And Guido, if you want to add something, please.
I think actually this is be a long coffee break since this is the last session of the day. So
it's dinner for
dinner break. So thank you very much for attending also the sessions today, and tomorrow we will start earlier than yesterday and today. We will start at 8:30 with the second keynote speech of this conference given by Dr. Masakatsu Fujiwara from NTT. So I wish all of you a pleasant evening, if in Europe or in other places, I don't know, but see you tomorrow at 8:30. Okay.
Bye. Thanks again to all the speakers and to the audience. Bye-bye.
Okay. So Gianfranco, you can stop the video recording. Thank you.